Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I have Kevin Mitchell on the podcast. Kevin is an associate professor of genetics and neuroscience at Trinity College Dublin. He has a bachelor's from Trinity College Dublin in genetics and has a PhD in neurobiology from the University of California at Berkeley. He is the author of Innate, How the Wiring of Our Brains Shapes Who We Are. And that is what we talk about in this episode. We start the conversation by talking about some of his genetic and neuroscience background and his reasoning for writing the book. We discuss why developmental variation is important and understanding the intersection of genes and the environment as a type of trajectory. We talk about how each person responds to the environment as a key element. And so in his book and in much of his writing and in the conversation, we're kind of trying to find this middle ground between the age-old nature-nurture argument. Many people will have these ideas that it's one or the other, or one is more heavily emphasized than the other. And what Kevin tries to do is he tries to kind of just say, okay, both of these are important, but split it down the middle and say, really, what is the interaction of the person in particular environments with their genes and with many other things. We talk about the ongoing trajectory of genetic predispositions and environmental interactions. We talk about the genome as a system or program and how it interacts with certain types of noise within that system. We talk about traits versus genes, genetic variation, and how these two things work together, or sometimes not. We talk about how neuropsychiatric disorders are implicated by genetic variation and have strong heritable traits. We talk about mutation and some of the polygenic backgrounds. We talk about genetics and biology and how their influences can have different presentations in some different neuropsychiatric disorders. We talk about how much of our genetic programming is set before we're born in utero. We talk about what environment is and how we define that. And we use intelligence as an example for this nature-nurture element. We don't get into too many controversial waters here, but we do kind of wave at that, and we understand that there is some controversy with intelligence and genetics. And again, Kevin has a very kind of middle ground here. You know, both things are important, both things are true, and how do we understand the interactions between them? We talk about the importance of twin studies. Many people use this. Many people use this in their in many studies, and you'll see this pop up. And so we talk about why we use twin studies in research and why it's important. We talk about how intelligence is sort of, at least in Kevin's mind, analogous to performance in humans. We talk about the use of polygenic scores on educational attainment, the role of epigenetics and neuroplasticity, and many other topics. I was super thrilled to have Kevin. He was so nice to come on. His book is great. I recommend it often to people. He's one of these guys that is, really, really good at breaking things down and explaining things while also keeping the richness of the content there. And we need a lot more people like him to be able to explain really hard concepts such as genetics and some of the neuropsychiatric disorders and environment interactions to the general public. And he is definitely doing that. And so I really enjoyed this, and I hope everybody does as well. And so now I bring you Kevin Mitchell. I am here with Kevin Mitchell. Kevin, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's a big honor. Appreciate it.
Phil, thanks very much. It's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. You've written a fantastic book. It's called Innate: How the Wiring of Our Brains Shapes Who We Are. This is 3 years? Is this 3 years old already?
Yeah, it's from 2018. Yeah.
Yeah, that's wild how fast it's gone by. So
And I have the
Yeah.
the soft cover edition, so you're already up to soft cover. So that's always a good sign for publishing and everything for one's book. So that's great.
Yeah, and I think they did a real nice job with the paperback. Actually, it looks really well.
Yeah, no, it's gorgeous. That's great. So just tell us, I'll give you a full introduction, but just tell us who you are, what you do, what you study, and kind of your reasoning for writing this book.
Sure, yeah. I'm a associate professor of genetics and neuroscience at Trinity College in Dublin, in Ireland. And I'm interested broadly in, I guess, genes, brains, and minds. So my work started in understanding how the brain gets put together. So how do the genetic instructions encoded in the genome that specify, a human brain or a chimp brain or a fly brain or whatever it is, actually get executed as the embryo develops, so that you get all the right types of neurons in the right place, and especially that they get connected to each other in the right way. So that's a really enormously complex task that the organism and its genome has to solve, basically, is that encoding the rules for all those processes for the brain to effectively self-assemble. And my interest in that sort of parlayed into behavioral genetics and psychiatric genetics, with the idea that if you have that program of development, then you're also inevitably going to have variation in that program, just as we have variation in the program for making a face, for example. And that's why we all have different looking faces. So we'll all have slightly different structured brains, and function follows, from structure. So we may also thereby have slightly different minds. And in fact, there's obviously really good evidence that lots of behavioral traits are partly genetic in origin, that people who are more closely related to each other resemble each other psychologically, not just physically. And so, it turns out that, those fields of behavioral genetics, psychiatric genetics, and developmental neurobiology have converged lately, because when people have found the genes that, actual genetic variants in the genome that affect those traits, turns out that they're mainly affecting how the brain develops. So there was a sort of a convergence of my interests there, which then led me to write the book, because I felt that in particular the developmental lens gives a really good perspective on the understanding of the relationship between genes, your genotype, that is all the genetic variants that you happen to carry or that I happen to carry, and our phenotypes, the traits that we express either physically or behaviorally. So it's been known for a long time that there is a relationship between genes and those traits, but it's the nature of that relationship that I was trying to explore in the book, and the idea that it's realized through the processes of development. There is no direct linkage. There aren't, particular genes underpinning particular behavioral traits. There's a whole program of brain development. It can be affected by variation, and it manifests across a whole spectrum of psychological traits. So that perspective I felt was useful, and maybe a bit of a novel angle on that relationship, but also it highlights another really important part and a major theme of the book, which is that development itself is a source of variation between people. We often think of genetic differences or environmental differences. And if something's not genetic, it's assumed that the rest of the variation affecting must be environmental. But that word is very misleading. It's non-genetic. It doesn't mean that there's something out there in the world. And in fact, the processes of development themselves are actually highly variable. You can start from the exact same genome and run the program multiple times, which we see in identical twins, or we see in animals that are genetic clones of each other, and you don't get the same outcome every time, not because of anything in the environment, just because the program is kind of noisy. So that was my main sort of impetus for writing the book, and that's sort of where I came to that.
No, that's all great, and I think that that's the wonderful thing about your argument, and what makes it so powerful is you talk about the kind of program that's kind of set in place by kind of before birth, and then how there's so much variation, and so kind of trying to, at least when I read it, was trying to splice between this kind of, maybe I don't want to say false dichotomy, because there's obviously the genetic component, environmental component, but that it's not an either or, it's kind of a both and it's more of how do we have developmental variation with both of those in tandem. And some things may load more on the genetic components, and some things may load more on the environmental, but that more so it's the developmental variation, which, when I read it, I never really thought of it that way. And it was a very convincing argument to me reading the book. So it's I think it's not only is it illuminating, but it's very powerful for what it could imply as well, in terms of how we understand behavior or many other things for humans.
Yeah. And well, thanks for that. And I think that for me, what has been a change in my own perspective, and I guess something that now anchors the way that I try to think about things, is the idea of a trajectory, right? Rather than a fixed static relationship between genes and phenotype, or even between initial predispositions and their psychological manifestations. The idea that that's always dynamic, that there's always a trajectory of happening that is interactive, right, between initial phenotype and your environment, that you're partly creating that environment, that it's feeding back and potentially influencing the elaboration and development of those traits and the expression of those traits over time. So for me, it's a more nuanced and realistic and kind of useful way of thinking about it, that and in a sense, it's to me, it feels kind of optimistic because it's, things are not written in stone. They're not fixed. There is a trajectory certainly in the emergence of our character and our cognitive potential and abilities and so on over time, that is this, comes from this interplay between initial genetic predispositions, capacities, tendencies, and the way in which you then interact with your environment across the course of your lifetime.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I think it makes it's a more holistic sense of things, which many of the things that we are understanding about within neuroscience now is that kind of element of how are things working in tandem, as opposed to all of these certain regions of the brain or regions of the body. How is there a cohesive whole? And so I think there's much of what you're saying is within that tradition. Although I can hear many of the criticisms from the hereditary folks and from the cultural environmental folks on both sides. So I'm sure you get a lot of shit from both ends. So, but
well, yeah. I mean, I think not as much as you might think, actually, because I hope that what I've just described is kind of reasonable, right? It just seems hard to argue with it, and rather than just sort of in a hand wavy way saying, oh, it's just a bit of both, I'm trying to figure out is, okay, well, but how, right? I mean, how is it a bit of both? How do those things interact? Yeah. And they interact in interesting ways, and sometimes unexpected ways. Like I think people often think that, okay, maybe we do have some genetic predispositions, but environment can trump that. And in fact, I think what tends to happen is that environment tends to amplify those initial predispositions because of the way that we select our own environments and choose our own experiences, and we're doing things that we like because we're good at them, and that reinforces what we're good at. Say reading, for example. You may one child may really enjoy reading because of some initial difference from another child who may find reading difficult. Maybe they're dyslexic, maybe there's some other reason, right? So there may be a small difference between those two children at a certain age, but their habits and the way that they behave and interact with engage with reading over time, for one of them will be a a virtuous cycle, right? They'll keep getting better and better at it. They enjoy it more and more because they're getting better at it, and it's more satisfying. For the other one, they don't do it much. When they do it, it's frustrating. They get criticized. Maybe they get held back in school. There's all this sort of negative reinforcement, and they withdraw from. So if you have these two children in that situation where there's an initial predisposition that makes one of them a little better at reading or like it a little bit more than the other one, then their experiences can amplify that over time. And ultimately, if you just look in adults at the heritability of reading, you can find a big effect, but actually part of it was an environmentally reinforcing mechanism. It doesn't mean that all of it is directly biologically caused. That biology interacts with the environment to form the eventual phenotype, to inform the eventual phenotype, and that for me is just feels like the right way to think about things like that, as opposed to trying to parse those elements out completely. And of course, when we're looking at components of variance, statistically speaking, you can parse them separately, but you have to, in order to do that, you have to make an assumption, which is there is no correlation between the two things, right? So you can treat the genetic variance separate from the environmental variance as additive components that contribute to the total variance in the trait, but only if you assume that differences in genetics don't themselves influence the environment. And that assumption is routinely broken for behavioral psychological traits, which I think is an important lesson. And it does mean that the sort of simplifying assumptions that underpin a lot of this, it's this much genes and that much environment, they just sort of run out of steam at one point. They just stop being useful. They're not right. And they're at some point they become actively misleading, I think.
Yeah, well, there's definitely examples of where, and for certain things or certain concepts where they do become misleading. And I think in the book somewhere you mentioned that there's this idea of, yes, you can have certain genetic predispositions or carry various genes that are active, but it always is going to depend on the individual responding to the environment. So it's never a kind of, again, either or. It's kind of you have some parts genetically, but then it's how each individual responds to what's various inputs from the environment. It sounds like some of what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, that's that dynamic interplay whereby, you could have two people who are genetically identical and who even, well, first of all, let me back up. Two people who are genetically identical may not start with the same phenotypes. In fact, they almost certainly won't, right? Because of this developmental variation. And for some traits, you just get some sort of quantitative variation, like for height, right? You have two twins and one might be a little bit taller than the other, right? But for some things, especially for some behavioral or traits or psychiatric illnesses, for example, you get really a probabilistic inheritance where you have dichotomous outcomes, and things like, you could have one twin develops schizophrenia and the other doesn't, or one twin develops autism and the other doesn't. And these are really strongly genetic, but what's inherited is a risk for the condition, not the condition itself. And whether the person actually develops it or not can depend to some degree on the variation in just the developmental run that led to that individual. And I mean, the same is true for handedness, for example. So, most people are right-handed, but being right or left-handed has a genetic component to it, but it's only partly genetic, yet it's really strongly innate, and it's very refractory to environmental influences, which suggests that, if you have, say, one parent who's left-handed, let's say the average rate of being left-handed is about 9% for women, about 11% for men. If you have one parent who's left-handed, that your likelihood of being left-handed is about 17%. If you have two parents who are left-handed, it's about 25%. And if you have a twin who's left-handed, it's about 30 or 40% or something like that. But in many cases, you're going to inherit a higher risk of being left-handed That's just a statistical term. It's not judgmental. A higher risk of being left-handed, but you won't actually express that, and you'll be really right-handed. So it's interesting just in the way that brain development happens. There are some non-linearities to it, where you kind of have this idea of a sort of a forking pathways that the organism can go down, and sometimes it'll go one to the right, and sometimes it'll go to the left, and so you'll end up with these quite potentially quite different outcomes, even from the same genotype. And then, of course, as you go on, differences in environment can lead to differences in how those psychological traits are expressed in that environment. And when I talk about psychological predispositions and the real sort of biologically innate stuff, those are things that only manifest in particular contexts. We don't see those traits. We just see how people behave in different situations. So there's a sort of a debate in psychology as opposed to whether it's mainly individual differences or behavior is mainly situational. And again, I think that dichotomy doesn't make sense. It's both really, and it's not, and it's an ongoing trajectory of that interplay, where people's habits tend to emerge and sort of get crystallized in a way that reflects both their predispositions and the situations that they've been in through their lives.
Yeah, I'll come back to that. I'm still on the left-handed thing. So here's an example. I'm curious about the generational thing. So my mother is left-handed, and so neither myself or my wife are left-handed. We're both right-handed, but my daughter is left-handed. So it's a very interesting kind of thing, right? Where it's like, well, you most obviously would say, well, there's not a gene for left-handedness, but that, because, there's someone in the family that's left-handed, there's some likelihood of the genetic predisposition. But, I guess, how do you explain how much of that is the interaction between genes and variation? Or, I know geneticists love talking about the switching, right? Genes switch on or off, or do they open? But across generations, how do we understand some of these things as well? You could see this obviously for, the recessive genes for, blue-green eyes, or you could see it for, other types of, like you're saying, disorders, things like that. But how do we understand it that way?
Yeah, well, so in some ways, when things, skip generations or they don't express fully, it is because of sort of simple, what's called Mendelian genetics that follow the laws of Gregor Mendel, like, eye color and so on. And in fact, even eye color turns out to be much, much more complicated than we thought it was, with many, many more genes involved and so on. But you can have, so blue eyes, skipping a generation, or red hair, two parents who aren't red haired who have a red haired child, because they both carry what's a recessive allele. But you can also just have this probabilistic expression of a genotype, even actually in genetically identical animals. So if you look, for example, in what are called isogenic or inbred strains of mice, where all the animals are always genetically identical. All of the genetic variation has been bred out by interbreeding them over and over and over again for many generations. And in some cases, they can carry a mutation that has a probabilistic expression. So an example that I look at in the book, actually, which is very striking, is this disconnectivity between the two hemispheres of the brain. So the hemispheres of the brain develop pretty independently, but then they get connected at a certain stage of embryogenesis by nerve fibers going from one side to the other. And they cross this little bridge of cells that has to form between the two hemispheres. The corpus callosum. Exactly. So the corpus callosum is the big fiber tract, but in embryonic terms, there's this little bridge of cells that fuses. They aren't nerve cells. They make a little bridge. And it's a very small number of cells, and it happens at a very particular point of development. And if it happens, then everything's hunky-dory, all the axons can go across. And if it doesn't happen, then the axons that pioneer that tract fail to get across, the hemispheres never fuse, and then millions and millions of axons that follow can't get across. So the two hemispheres remain completely unseparated. So you get this dichotomous outcome potentially. Now, most of the time in wild type animals, the developmental program in the genome is very robust, right? It's evolved to do this thing 100% of the time. Mm-hmm. But the program requires certain proteins to be expressed to actually carry out those developmental processes. And if you introduce mutations, then the likelihood that the process happens can change. So sometimes it will, and sometimes it won't. If it does, if those cells fuse, all the axons go across, you have an animal with a nicely connected corpus callosum, but you can have a genetically identical animal that has none. And you can, with different mutations, the likelihood of that happening could be 30%, it could be 50%, but it's always pretty dichotomous.
Is that just a factor of natural selection, though? Sometimes it could, and sometimes it couldn't. Is it something like that, or why some in some cases and others not?
Yeah, natural selection has built it so that ordinarily the whole program is quite robust, and it's robust to noise, just the randomness of biochemistry. When you're making, the genome is there, it makes some proteins in a given cell type. But exactly what happens to those proteins afterwards, they'll diffuse off in the cell. Their binding to other proteins is controlled by random kinetics. So it's all really noisy, jittery world there, right? The genome doesn't actually control that. It's not a machine. It's really messy wetware. So the genome has evolved to be robust to that noise and to channel development into an optimal operating range, right? But having said that, the flip side of that, because it's robust to that noise, it also becomes robust to mutations. So some mutations can be introduced where they don't cause much of an outcome, or they don't always cause a phenotype. But then, so paradoxically, what happens is that the robustness that is evolved in the system causes genetic variation to accumulate because it can be tolerated until, and natural selection then doesn't see it until it gets to a point where it can't be tolerated anymore. And then in that individual, they may be selected against, in that they may die or they may not breed, but the underlying variation that's there can't be selected against until it manifests that way. So that's how you can get this sort of phenotypic ranges that we see ordinarily. And occasionally then you'll get a big phenotypic difference, one that we typically call disease, or recognize as a disease, right? And it also, just to come back to where we started, explains why you can get this probabilistic thing, because the system in this case, because you've taken out some of the components, is now a little more sensitive to noise than it used to be. And sometimes the noise will push it one way or the other. And so really it's a manifestation of the underlying noise, which ordinarily the system can buffer, but when you have some mutations, it can buffer it less well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. I'm tracking with you. And so it really just, there is this sort of, what you're laying out is this kind of, maybe not intentionally, but it doesn't really, and how we understand genetics like this within the brain and within the body is for this type of genetic determinism. But before we come to that, I do want to ask, so we have this idea of, I think you said in the book, I don't remember where, I think it's in the beginning, that a trait is genetic, yeah, but there's no genes for that trait, right? So this is kind of a little bit of what you've been saying. So there aren't, so maybe we can say what a trait is and isn't, but then we can elaborate on how there aren't specific genes for that trait necessarily. Is this correct?
Yeah. Yes. So this is again, it's a subtle point, but it's an important one. So a trait, first of all, is just anything that varies in the population. So we talked about eye color, right? Eye color is a trait. Eye number is not a trait.
Oh, I don't have 4 eyes, right? I have 2 eyes.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So eye number doesn't vary genetically. We all have 2 eyes. It can vary for because of accidents and things like that.
Sure.
but generally not. So, so having two eyes is genetically encoded, but it's not a trait because it doesn't vary in the population. And a lot of what geneticists are interested in is the variation between individuals, or if you want to zoom out, the variation between species, or over evolutionary time. Yeah. But within a species, the variation within individuals, how much does genetic variation influence whatever the trait happens to be? Mm-hmm. So you can show that many traits have a genetic component to them, right? And you can do this by looking at twins, at people who were adopted, at people who are related to each other by different degrees, and seeing how similar they are to each other in ways that aim at least to control for environmental similarities, like being raised in the same family or not, right? And of course, you can do that in animals in much more controlled ways. And when people do that in animals, they do it with a view towards defining how heritable a trait is, which for them means if I select the animals that have the highest, say, milk yield for cows, then what's the next generation likely to look like? If it's genetic, then I pick the ones with the highest milk yield. I should get ones with higher milk yield in the next generation. And I should be able to keep doing that. And that's exactly what happens. And the heritability predicts how successful that selection program is going to be in pushing the phenotype directionally. Right? Mm-hmm. So it's a very clearly operationalized idea in animal breeding and plant breeding, where you can control the environment and so on. In human studies, it's a bit more of an inference that you're drawing, and you're trying to use sort of natural experiments like twins, identical twins versus fraternal twins, mm-hmm. or adoptions and so on, to kind of pseudo control for environment. But in any case, we end up with the idea that a trait is at least partly genetic, right? And then we want to know, okay, well, if that's true, then ordinarily when we're doing genetic analysis in, say, model organisms like flies or worms or mice, the reason that we do it, the reason that we try to find mutants that affect a particular trait, is that we can then find the gene that's affected, mm-hmm. and that will tell us about the biological processes that underpin whatever we're looking at.
Right.
So that's a very powerful mechanism in experimental genetics. In humans, we don't control the first step. We're not creating the genetic variation. We just have to take whatever is out there, right? Mm-hmm. Whatever mutation and selection has generated in the population. So the consequence of that is that when we're looking at, complex genetic traits, quantitative traits in humans, things that don't vary between like brown eyes and blue eyes, but things like height or IQ or personality traits, is that first of all, they're affected by genetic variants in many, many different genes.
Yeah. Right.
There isn't really very, one specific gene affecting
right.
language and one
it's
specific
not a one-to-one. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So lots and lots of genetic variation
right.
can exist. Lots of genes can carry mutations that could affect a phenotype, and they might do it directly, kind of. Say for height, there could be genes that affect growth factors and things like that, right?
Or let's take an example of the fact that I lost all of my hair at 23. Well, I didn't lose all of it, but I lost most of it enough that I shaved my head. I'm bald.
Yeah.
And that's a genetic trait?
Yeah. Yes, it is. Yeah, absolutely. So that varies between people. That's a highly genetic, genetic trait.
Sucks,
and
I've accepted it.
Yeah, it works. It works for you.
I make it work. 15 years later, I make it work. So
yeah. So yes, okay. So so that's a trait, but the genetics of that is definitely simpler than the genetics of something like intelligence or personality and so on.
With baldness, it's maternal side, is that correct?
Well, there's a story. I'm not sure if that story is actually right.
Okay.
I think it's probably a simplification, just like the eye color story was. Basically, the rule is everything's more complicated than than we thought at first.
Mm-hmm.
But for other traits like psychological traits, the question is, when you look at the genes that are affected, and we can track down the actual genetic variants that influence these traits, mm-hmm. what kinds of genes are they? And it turns out that for psychological traits, they're mostly genes involved in development, and not really specific development of very specific bits of the brain. They're just kind of generically involved in development, or mutations in them affect development. You wouldn't necessarily say the function of the gene is to instruct neural development, yet mutations in it could affect the biochemistry of the cells in a way that indirectly undermines or causes variation in the processes of development. So it turns out that there are many, many more ways to indirectly affect something genetically than there are to directly affect whatever the process is. And for some things like, say we're looking at cancer, right? When we look at the genes that are involved in cancer, they're directly involved in things like DNA repair, cell replication, control of the cell cycle, maintenance of differentiated cell states. And that makes complete sense because the phenotype that we're looking at in cancer is a cellular level phenotype. It is disruption in DNA repair, DNA replication, cell cycle, and cell differentiation, right? So it makes sense that the proteins that are affected there would be directly involved in those processes. When we look at psychological traits, there are no proximal molecular processes that are doing the work, right? Our psychology emerges from the workings of our brain. It's a property, those are emergent properties of the whole neural system. Getting back to the sort of more holistic neuroscience view that you were talking about, those can't be reduced to the actions of very specific proteins because they don't emerge from the actions of very specific proteins. They emerge from the way the whole brain works, which is a function of how the whole brain is put together, as well as some ongoing, biochemistry and so on, that because it is a biochemical and a bioelectrical machine. So when we don't find particular genes that underpin intelligence or particular genes that underpin schizophrenia or autism or neuroticism or extroversion. That just isn't the nature of the relationship between those genes and those traits, because they're not like cancer or other much more proximally cellular phenotypes.
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask when you were saying that. Is my first jump to is, well, is this true of many neuropsychiatric disorders, or is this true of the neurodevelopmental disorders? So, and is there a difference there? So, for example, we can get to it, and that's a much longer conversation. But there are many things like depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety, etc. But which I would imagine have, I'm assuming, but would have more variance there because of the interactions with the environment. But it might be a little bit more different with, say, autism or learning disorders and or schizophrenia. I mean, I've sort of conceptualized schizophrenia for a long time as a type of neurodegenerative disorder, really, is how I see it.
No, it is. Well, that's interesting, but it isn't actually. It really is a neurodevelopmental disorder as well. All of the evidence points to that, and the genetics very strongly corroborates that view. That actually, even though it doesn't manifest until early 20s often or later, that the reason for that is it reflects a kind of a latent let's say fragility of the neural systems that, as the brain matures, gets revealed. It turns out that in your early 20s, what's happening actually in some parts of your brain is there's a massive pruning of synaptic connections happening. And the idea is that one idea, at least, is in people with who later developed schizophrenia at that time. That underlying latent vulnerability is exposed by the normal processes of maturation, which in a normal healthy brain are good. They make it a leaner, meaner machine after it's had a long, protracted period of learning and experience-dependent development. So schizophrenia, autism, ADHD, tic disorders, they're all sort of in a family, and actually genetic risk for those is very overlapping, and it overlaps with intellectual disability and epilepsy and so on. So if you have a relative with with say schizophrenia, then your risk of having schizophrenia is statistically higher, but your risk of having epilepsy is higher. Your risk of having autism is higher.
It's just a constellation of disorders that are kind of connected.
It's a sort of what's been termed developmental brain dysfunction that can be inherited, and then how it manifests again may be a function of the idiosyncrasies of individual brain development. But we can contrast those disorders, and actually, I mean, depression, bipolar disorder, they're probably in that same group as well. They're not as strongly heritable. They probably they do have a more experiential components to whether they're expressed or not. But and I think actually it's interesting and somewhat tragic. Over the last year or so, we've seen that played out. So in my university, with the students have been offline for the whole year, right? Many of them just in their bedroom, 18 hours a day. They hardly see anybody. They have no sort of social supports. They don't have the normal structures and so on. And there's been a massive, massive increase in the number of students with really severe psychiatric presentations, not just going to counseling, feeling a little anxious, but with really clinically, diagnosed depression and so on. And I think it illustrates the idea that you can have many people who may have a kind of an underlying vulnerability who are perfectly able to cope well under normal circumstances, but when those supports are stripped away, or they're hit with a challenge like what we've had in the last year, then that vulnerability can be expressed. So anyway, sorry, there was a little digression, but the idea is we have these neurodevelopmental disorders, which are inherited as a group, but kind of probabilistically. But then if you contrast those with neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, then you really do see a different set of genes coming up in those. And you do see, so those can be caused by the aggregation of very particular proteins, for example, or at least they're associated with that, and they're associated with risk in the genes that encode those proteins or ones that interact with them. So that it's an illustrative contrast, I think, to draw, in that those neurodegenerative ones, even though they manifest in complex psychology, right, the memory loss and other personality change and stuff like that, right? So the phenotypes are still manifested psychologically. The underpinning is very different in that there is a direct, specific molecular cause in some of those. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit in terms of how much we know about that, but it certainly, the degeneration can be caused by fewer sort of genetic insults, I think, than what happens in neurodevelopment, which is just a big gamish of genetic variants, all sort of having this overall effect, but none of them necessarily doing anything very specific.
So so let's use autism for an example. I mean, because it's one of those things where there is a genetic component, for sure. And as you were saying earlier, I wanted to ask about that as well, was that there's many genes that are implicated in, or could be potentially implicated in the expression of what we scale up to as autism, or what we know as autism. And of course, autism is quite varied. It is a spectrum because of the presentation is so varied for many
Absolutely.
folks. So now, I don't know if this is the right place to kind of add this on here, because it might be a whole other kind of section. But one of the things that we in I don't know, at least 10 years, maybe even longer, have become, I don't want to say obsessed with, but people like it a lot, and I'm sure you have opinions about this, is we'll have these really large Gwas studies, right? Yeah. And so maybe just tell us about that and how we use that, and if that's also helpful in understanding which genes and all the ones that are connected, and et cetera.
Absolutely. So autism is a really, really interesting example, and obviously a really important one because it affects lots of people. And as you said, it's a spectrum, and And of course, it's a diagnosis, right? It's a label. And so it's a label that we attach to people because they present in sort of similar enough ways, this constellation of symptoms, that it's reproducible enough that we could recognize it as a thing.
Yeah.
And we call that thing autism.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean it's one thing. Genetically speaking, it isn't, right? It's not one thing any more than epilepsy is one thing or intellectual disability is one thing, right? Both of those conditions can be caused by mutations in any of hundreds of genes. Right? You can have a mutation in gene A, gene B, gene C, gene D. Any one of those can cause, say, intellectual disability. And the same is true for autism. It's a really highly heritable condition. I mean, it's very, very strongly genetic, the most strongly genetic neurological condition we know of, I think. Well, I mean, the complex one anyway. But it's can be caused by mutations in any one of hundreds of different genes.
In that way, when saying that it's one of the most, inheritable, does that just mean there's more genes that could potentially come online and be implicated? Or is it not just the number?
No, it's not exactly that. So what that will influence is the prevalence of the condition. So when you have a condition, say like intellectual disability, it's super strongly selected against. People with intellectual disability tend to have far fewer children, if any, right? So that's a paradox. Then why does it exist at the frequency that it does in the population? And the answer to that is that it exists because you get new mutations all the time. So say, they can be point mutations that affect a particular gene. They can be chromosomal disorders like Down syndrome or Williams syndrome or so on, right? So the reason why intellectual disability is as common as it is because mutations in so many different genes can cause it. So what that is reflecting is how many genes it takes to build a typically functioning brain.
I see.
So that's what we call the mutational target, basically. And it's the same mutational target that can give rise to autism as opposed to intellectual disability if it affects the development of the brain in a different way. So there's a very big mutational target that can, of genes that can be mutated to cause autism or indeed any of these other conditions like schizophrenia or epilepsy. But in addition to that, so we found over recent years lots of what we call high-risk mutations in people. Sometimes they're new mutations that have just arisen in the generation of sperm or eggs. That's quite common.
Sure.
Those tend to have very big effects by themselves because they can. Actually, because natural selection has never had a say about them, right? It's the first time they've appeared,
right.
And it's going to have a say, but it hasn't yet. So they're free to have as big an effect as they like. But then we also all have a background of mutations that we've inherited from our parents, from their parents, and so on. And natural selection has had a go at them, right? So the only ones that tend to be common in the population are ones that have small effects. Because ones that have big effects never become common in the population. They get selected against. So we have this big background of common genetic variation. And then occasionally each of us has a much more idiosyncratic pattern of very rare mutations. And sometimes those rare mutations cause a disease. Most of the time they don't, but they contribute to our phenotypes in other ways. So the genome-wide association studies are aimed at tracking the effects of those common genetic variants. And they use these genotyping platforms, the same ones that are used at things like 23andMe or Ancestry.com for tracking relatives. They track these common variants across the genome. Some of those are statistically associated with a very, very, very slightly increased risk of autism or whatever the trait may be, a tiny statistical effect individually, but there's thousands and thousands of them. So collectively, they kind of give a background of that increases your risk potentially. And the way that that genetics comes together is that those rare mutations, whether, if you inherit one of those high risk mutations, whether or not you actually express the disease or alternatively can buffer the effects of that mutation depends to a certain extent, to a large extent, on your background of other these common genetic risk variants. So this polygenic background you have, at least I think of it, and I think there's mounting evidence that this is the case, as a general modifying factor that sort of indexes how robust your genome is in the development of in directing the development of typical brain, and how well it can buffer the effects of these new big rare mutations that pop up every once in a while. So the genetics is really complicated. It's really messy. The interesting thing is when you look at the types of genes that we see that have the rare mutations, and you look at the types of genes that we see that have the common variants, they're both still enriched for neurodevelopmental genes, generally speaking, right? There was a hope that we would get to specific biology that way.
Yeah.
And you don't, because the specific biology doesn't lie at the level of the genes. It lies in the trajectory of brain development, and the idea that the phenotype, the state of something like autism or something like psychosis or epilepsy is kind of an attractor state in a dynamic system. So it's a property of the neural system. It isn't a property of anything to do with the functions of the genes, unlike, as I mentioned earlier, cancer, which really is proximally related to the molecular functions of the genes themselves.
Let me see if I can. It's so interesting. It's really interesting. So is it kind of like genes are like this? Man, it seems like, I don't want to say malleable, but they're not static.
Well,
they're in play all the time.
The system is not static. Yeah,
the
exactly.
system
So
is in play.
The system is not static, and I think that that the only way to make sense of this is through a dynamical systems perspective. So, I mentioned at the start that I think that the lens of development is necessary. You have to look through that to understand how genotypes relate to phenotypes. And I didn't use the vocabulary at the time, but really that is a dynamical systems perspective, where the system is, it's complicated. It can be in lots of different configurations, but that it's evolving through time in a way where the way that it evolves depends on its history, right? There are trajectories. There are certain ways that it can evolve. And I like to think, at least, of a lot of psychiatric symptoms as these sort of attractor states within a dynamical system. So what that means is that you have a system that's described by the activity of, say, lots of neurons in the brain. Right? And ordinarily, there's some sort of dynamical pattern that the brain is moving through these different regimes as you're doing things, thinking things, and so on. But occasionally, it can get into a regime where that's pathological. And I think, the most obvious example is a seizure. Right, where you've got a pattern of electrical activity that you can understand as an electrical burst. You can track it in the brain, and you can see, first of all, what's happening during a seizure, but secondly, what happens after a seizure that leads to a kind of a remodeling of the circuits that then increases the likelihood that the brain will go back into that state. So that same sort of analogous thing can happen, for example, in psychosis. The longer it's left untreated, the more likely it is to fall into that state. If you like, the well that represents the attractor state gets deeper, and it gets harder to get out of again. So what's interesting when you think about psychiatric conditions like that, you can start with some broad genetic vulnerability, and then you have to ask, well, why does it manifest one way in one person versus another? But more generally, why does it manifest like this? Why are these the ways that the system goes awry, when you could think of an infinite number of other ways that we don't see, right? I mean, there's lots of other ways that the brain doesn't go wrong that theoretically you could think it could, but we just don't observe those. What we observe is this sort of channeling into, like I said, these constellations of symptoms, these endpoints that we recognize as being similar to each other, even though the starting points may be completely different, completely different genetic vulnerability in different patients, yet they end up in this same state, or the flip side, the exact same genetic vulnerability in identical twins who then take diverging paths and end up in different states.
It's one of those, I like the well analogy. I think that's really good because it kind of shows, again, how there is this kind of dynamic aspect to it in terms of a system, and how there's many ways in which there are many things we can't know, but there's some things we can sort of kind of know, is what it sounds like. And it's like, okay, like this left untreated is only going to likely make things worse. It's interesting because, you know, I've said this to students and in clinical practice, where it's like, you can have 10 people in a room that have depression, but it's going to manifest differently. You know, wow, how could that be? Depression is depression. And it's like, well, there's enough variance because kind of what you were saying in the beginning, when people talk about labels, I try to explain this to students and clients is, well, we basically have observable behaviors, which we know are linked back to other components in biology and environment, that happens enough to say this constellation of symptoms is this. So instead of always talking about all of these symptoms, we just say this kind of shorthand label. And I just see labels as shorthand. The problem with the label is that it doesn't always capture many of the aspects of certain disorders that have so much variance in how they present. And some can have more deleterious effects than others, right? And it's especially where you have, you know, mild, moderate, severe forms of these disorders. So it's just interesting how, again, when you're looking at it underneath the surface, and then also what we see in behavior is so interesting how there's a lot of variability there.
Yeah, and the genetics really kind of reinforces the idea that these are not natural kinds from an etiological point of view, right? In the way that, you know, Down syndrome is a natural kind. It has one clear cause, right? Depression is like I said, the end point, right? The manifestation, and autism and schizophrenia and so on, the same. And in fact, you know, you said we have these diagnostic labels. Of course, they're subject to convention. We made them, and we define the criteria, and every once in a while we redefine the criteria. And of course, a patient may have the criteria that satisfy the diagnosis of depression, you know, now, and next year they may satisfy bipolar disorder or something else. So people move through those things. They don't reflect the dynamics of the biology well. And I think of them as placeholders, because actually pretty much all psychiatric diagnoses are diagnoses of exclusion. Right. So when someone comes in, they manifest with psychosis, you kind of go down the list and say, well, you know, are they taking any psychotic inducing drugs right now, or have they in the past? You know, previously not so common now, but you know, do they have syphilis? You know, something like that. And once you tick off all of those as negative, all the known organic causes, then you're left with basically idiopathic cases. That is, you look like this, you look like those other patients over there. We don't know what's causing their problem either, but we're going to call it schizophrenia, and it's just a placeholder, which is fine as long as people remember that's what it is, and they don't reify the concept into some imagining there's some underpinning biological thing that's monolithic and static, because that clearly is the wrong way to think about things.
Yeah, it's exactly how I talk about it with students when I teach diagnosis, is exactly that way. It's like, you know, many of these things is we're trying to see what it isn't, and then we're left with these things and we classify it as this thing, you know, schizophrenia or whatever. But we have to make sure we kind of tease out all these other things that may or may not be known. You kind of mentioned it, but I wanted to ask, in the book you talk about is that much of genetic variation is set out before birth, but you know, it's a program that's set out, not the specifics. And so it seems like maybe talk about kind of this before birth, because I hadn't really thought of it that way, of kind of I guess you could say the building blocks at the genetic level, even before we get to 9 months, or we get to, you know, we've just born and we're out in the world. There's so many things that have already been in motion. And then once the person is born, then, how does this all play out or potentially play out?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, obviously, massive amounts of brain development happen before birth. Most of the brain is laid out. Mm-hmm. There's tons of growth that happens afterwards, but all the bits of the brain are there. All of the connections are basically there. There's going to be a lot of refinement. Humans have this protracted period of development, which allows us to learn amazingly rich information over an extended period of time. But that's refining a map that's been laid down during development prior to birth and shortly after birth, really. So if we look at identical twins, then we see already, like, you can measure the brains of identical twins, and you can measure them as infants and so on, and you can already see that there are differences in infants or children who are identical in the structure of their brains. So their brains look very, very similar to each other, but not completely identical. And some parts of the brain, interestingly, the earlier maturing ones, like say the primary visual centers, the primary somatosensory areas and so on, actually also earlier evolving bits of the brain, they're more heritable. It's like they're more fixed by a genetic program. And then other parts of the brain that develop a bit later, the sort of the intervening parts of the cortex that do more associative functions, they're a bit less heritable, right? There's a little bit more variation between identical twins in those areas, which I think is really interesting because that reflects the fact that they're developing in a more experience-dependent way than the earlier areas. So there's not one answer to it, right? Some bits are more fixed early, other bits are ongoing. And as I mentioned, a little while ago, some parts of the brain continue maturing until our early 20s, and the prefrontal cortex is the preeminent example there, where, like I said, there's all this synaptic pruning that's happening, because actually we're born with more synapses than we have now. Right? There's just this profusion, this exuberance of synaptic connections, and the brain develops with those synaptic connections in place, which gives it a chance to optimize itself, basically. And there's lots of spare capacity. The synapses that are used are strengthened, and the ones that are not used are eventually pruned away, but after a long period of time. So you've got these processes of prenatal development, which set the basic structure of the brain.
This would be with the neural tube. Is this where it's...
Sure. Well, I mean, you've got all these processes, right, that have to happen in a developing embryo. First of all, you have to make the nervous system apart from everything else in the embryo, right? You have to make muscles, skin, internal organs, nervous system. You have to pattern it, right? So you need a brain at the top and a spinal cord at the bottom. You need to make all the separate elements in the right places. You need your hippocampus and your thalamus and your cerebellum and your bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, and all these little bits. I mean, it's all these little bits that we don't think about much or talk about much. And then they all have to be connected to each other, and they're connected sometimes over extremely long distances in a really complicated way. The brain is not just a big kind of sponge of neurons just connecting one to one next to each other. It's incredibly structured and very, very has a very, very complicated wiring diagram that's laid out by these molecules that kind of act as signposts for guiding neurons that have different receptors that they like to go this way or that way and so on. So all that process happens. Even at birth, you've already got if you're people doing fMRI experiments now on infants, where they're already seeing these functional networks that are there, from a very early age. So a lot of the functional architecture of the brain is already manifested in an infant brain, but of course it's going to develop and mature. And so what you have then is a dual trajectory where you have processes of maturation and growth happening at the same time as you have processes of experience-dependent refinement. And it's important that those two things happen together. But again, the important thing is that that's an ongoing trajectory. So whatever your genetic sort of predispositions are in terms of how your brain was structured and functions at the time you're born, there's going to be then an interplay and an ongoing effect in terms of maturation. And of course, you can have genetic effects on maturation. The genetic effects don't stop when you're born. Those processes still require protein functions. They're still part of the genetic program. And you can have genetic effects on experience-dependent development. That still requires proteins that do synaptic plasticity and so on. When we're learning things, there's still that still has molecular underpinnings. And if you affect you have variation in the genes that encode those components, then the way that you learn can itself be a genetic trait. So it's sort of layers of interactions and interactions of the interactions as you go along this trajectory.
But the program for this stuff is set before we even get to labor and post utero. It's already set in place. It's still developing, but there's enough of the building blocks there to push it there.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the program is in the genome. Right? So the program is there. The program is there from the minute the egg gets fertilized. Okay, so you have a single-celled embryo that has the program to build a human being, including a human brain, and its particular genome has the program to build a human brain like this, right? But not exactly, not any particular outcome. All it encodes is these rules, these biochemical rules. This cell makes that protein, this cell makes that protein. The effect of that is that this cell will connect to that cell if everything goes right. But exactly how many connections it makes is a bit variable. Exactly how many of each cell type you make is a bit variable, and so on. So by the end of gestation, right, by birth, you've had 9 months of that program playing out, and a lot of the connectivity of the brain is in place at that stage. But there's nothing magic about birth. The genetic program keeps going, right? And we'll see, for example, puberty, right, as a part of maturation is clearly a genetically encoded thing that happens much later, but on a schedule. And the same, similar things are happening in our brains, especially at puberty. Actually, there's all kinds of stuff happening in brains at that stage. So so there's a lot in place there, and we clearly are born different from each other. And anyone who says the blank slate idea holds any water is just wrong. That's just not the case. We aren't born the same, and we are born with predispositions that do affect how we behave in the world over time.
But we're still on kind of the genetics of sorts, and I want to move to environment. But just before we do that, you talk about it a lot. And many people may have seen this or heard this, but we use a lot of what we call DZ and MZ twin studies, and we also use adoption studies as well. But just kind of give us the kind of main reason why we use that and why that's so important, I guess, in a general way.
Well, so as I was saying earlier, if, one of the pieces of evidence that a trait has some genetic underpinnings to it is if people who are related to each other are similar in that trait, right? Now, the problem with just looking at people who are related to each other and asking, are they similar in a trait, is you'll have all these family effects that show up. Like if you ask if the trait is wealth, for example, then people who are related to each other are similar in how wealthy they are, but that's nothing to do with genetics there. So we need to control for that, right? So ideally, what you would like to do to ask this question, do genetic differences contribute to differences in a trait? You can flip that on its head and say, well, if that's true, then people who are more genetically similar should be more similar in the trait. So we can start with people who are 100% similar to each other, identical twins, and then ask how similar they are to each other in the trait. The problem with that is you don't control for the environment. So the way to control for the environment is to use another set of twins, type of twins, which are fraternal twins. They're just like siblings. They happen to be born at the same time and raised in the same environment. And then ask, how similar are they to each other? So you get lots of pairs of identical twins, lots of pairs of fraternal twins, and you see how similar is each pair. And say if you do this for height, you'll find the identical twins are really similar, and the fraternal twins are similar, but only as similar as siblings are. right? So they're still, and then you can say, okay, well, they're both raised in the same environment within each pair. Right. These pairs, it's not that they have more similar environment than those. So that the increased similarity in monozygotic twins reflects the genetic, the effect of genetic similarity, or flipping it back, the effect of genetic variation on variation in the trait. So that's the basic idea. There's different studies, designs with twins who are reared together versus identical twins who are reared apart. And that's the opposite design, where your two sets, they're genetically similar to the same extent, but they either do or don't share a family environment. And then you can isolate the effect of sharing a family environment. As it happens for most psychological traits, that effect is really small. It's surprising that, people tend to think of, parenting has a big effect on, personality traits and stuff like that. And it has a big effect on lots of things, the ways that we behave, but not on these sort of underpinning biologically based traits that are measured and designed in effect to tap into biologically based traits. It's not that surprising that they're kind of refractory to those parental influences. So that's the reason why we do it, is to try and separate environmental from genetic components of variance. Now, and then once you have those study designs, you can do the mathematics to actually put a number on, say, the heritability or the contribution of a shared family environment to the overall phenotypic variance. And that number is a proportion, right? But the important thing is, it's not a real biological constant. It's not it's just within the population that you've studied, say 70% of the variance is associated with genetic differences, and the rest is non-genetic. But in a different population, it could be 50%. And one reason for that might be that in one of them, the environment is very uniform. So there isn't a lot of environmental variation that could affect the trait, whereas in another population, the environment might be quite variable, and therefore the proportion that's due to genetic variance goes down because the proportion that's due to environmental variance goes up. So it's important to realize that when we calculate a number like that, first of all, there's loads of assumptions that go into it. As I said before, you're assuming there's no correlations between genetics and environment, which is, we know to be wrong in many cases. But secondly, it's just a number that applies to the population that you studied. And it's not a truth, it's not like the speed of light or something. There's no right answer. Right.
Well, you're kind of touching it now, so I want to just jump to that, which is, environment, right? So the nurture element. So if you take a Psych 101 course, most people are going to say that humans are somewhere a composite of 50%, nature, genetics, and 50% nurture in the environment. I'm sure that that's a very, almost cartoon version of how we understand human beings. But not to say that it's not relevant. Obviously, both are implicated. Yeah. But okay, first, I guess, because I'll just say this. One of the things that absolutely gets under my skin for me, I don't know how it is for you, is people will choose, they do this cherry picking where they'll say, well, that just must be genetics for things they like, let's say, or don't like. And then if it's not, then they'll say, well, that's just your environment. That must be your environment, how you were raised, who your parents were. And so that's you. And they will make these very definitive statements about, well, because I can't explain it or I don't know it all, that must be the environment. And it's just very kind of dismissive, like, well, of course it's implicated, which drives me nuts because it's like, no, there are things that are true about our biology and there are things that are true about our environment, but you can't just choose when you want to pull that lever or not. So first, what can we say, or what do we mean when we say environment, what does that mean? And what are we talking about when we kind of say that?
Well, okay. So first of all, when we're talking about heritability, we're talking about, that's a number that applies to the population, and it applies to the variance that we see in some trait in a population. right? It doesn't explain why the mean of that trait is what it is. So, if we're looking at height, which I think is an accessible example, we'll see looking at population, we'll see this normal distribution, the bell curve of height distributions across the population, and genetics, we can measure the variance, which is effectively the width of that bell curve, right? And we can say, well, how much of that variance is due to genetic differences, which conceptually would be like saying, well, if everyone was a clone, how much narrower would that bell curve be? And for height, it would be much, much narrower, right? But everyone wouldn't be exactly the same, of course, but they'd be all like identical twins, right? So that's what heritability means. And we can say, when we look at variance, we can decompose it by sources. We can say there's a genetic source, it attributes this much of the variance, and there's an environmental source, it contributes this much of the variance. As I said earlier, when you're doing plant breeding or animal breeding, where you can really control things really tightly and ensure that there's no correlation between genetics and environment because you randomize and so on, you can really, really tightly control that, and it's perfectly fine, and the mathematics works out great. In humans, it's much more difficult to do that and disentangle the possible correlations of genetics and environment across the population. I'll come back to that in a sec when we might talk about it in the context of educational attainment, where it's really interesting.
I was going to say, maybe what we can do as we talk about this section and then the juxtaposition, maybe we can just use the example of IQ as like an example to illustrate the point.
Yeah. Well, so IQ is a tricky one, and it's laden with lots of baggage, of course.
It's got a history,
yeah. Well, so on the first level, this question of what IQ is, does it really measure anything about brains? Does it just measure how good you are at IQ tests and so on? I think the answer is no. It doesn't just measure how good you are at IQ tests. It's a very, very imperfect proxy of something different about brains that generally reflects, how good you are at problem solving, how quick you are at cottoning onto things, how, your levels of understanding, all the sort of colloquial metaphors or paraphrasing kind of terms we would have for what we recognize as somebody being intelligent or not. IQ kind of taps into that, right? It's a very imperfect proxy, but it is something that we can use as a measure in experiments. And I think if we approach it that way, we're not, it's odd to try and say everything about someone's intelligence can be captured on a single scale, right? Which it can't. But IQ captures some underpinning thing that contributes generally to many different aspects of intelligence, either intelligent behavior or different faculties, and so on, that make up these tests. Right?
My casual definition usually of intelligence when people ask me is, it's usually, it's how do you make decisions or problem solve in novel situations. That's usually kind of my general definition. I mean, people have different definitions, but that's my general, what we're trying to say about what it means to be intelligent, or your cognitive abilities, I guess, right? Is you have a new problem presented to you, and how do you figure it out and solve it in a particular way? And each person is going to have different ways of doing that, and different skill sets, if you will. Skill is maybe not the best word, but there's different ways in which you can do or not do.
Sure. Yeah. And so the question is, is that a thing, what you just described, is that a thing that varies across the population? And I think everyone would say yes, right? It is. I mean, clearly, that's just the case, that some people are taller than others, some people are faster, some people are stronger, some people are smarter. And it's true for children. And you can see it very early on that some children are brighter than others. And of course, we have the sort of extreme examples of intellectual disability, where it's not a question. It's very clear that these children can't do or struggle to do the types of things that you just said, or can't do them as well. Right? So the problem, I guess, the part of the baggage is that it's so defined. It's such the defining human trait that to even talk about variation in that way sounds judgment laden, right? It sounds like we're making a judgment decision when it's actually just a descriptive thing.
Yeah, right.
but it's interesting in that it is a defining characteristic of humans, our intelligence, right? It's really what separates us from other apes, exactly. Right. And so the reason we have human intelligence is because we have human brains, and the reason we have that is because we have human DNA. And if we had chimp DNA, we'd have a chimp brain and be as smart as a chimp, right? So inevitably, there is a program in the human genome, the canonical human genome, to make the canonical human brain with the canonical level of human intelligence. But there's also inevitable genetic variation. As I said, it builds up in that program because we can buffer a lot of it, right? But it builds up, so you will inevitably get variation. There's no way, even just from first principles, that a species-specific trait like that, that's genetically encoded, could not also have genetic variation in it within the population. It must have, unless it's something like having two eyes. Right? So from first principles, we know that there should be genetic variation that affects that because it's a genetically encoded trait that defines, that's there in humans. So when we use something like IQ as I said, an imperfect proxy to measure that and enable us to do these experiments where we go beyond just qualitatively saying, well, I think, Dick is smarter than Jane or whatever. Then we can do the same kinds of experiments that you would do for height, right? So you measure someone's IQ, you measure pairs of twins, you measure people in the general population, siblings, whatever, and you do exactly the same analyses to see how heritable the trait is. And you can look at people who are adopted away and so on and see how much does the family environment contribute to that. And so the upshot for IQ, which is actually, as it happens, similar for many other psychological traits, personality traits, is that it ends up about 50% heritable on average if you look across loads of different studies. Now, some studies will show higher heritability, others will show lower heritability. And interestingly, what you see a variation in the heritability of the trait depending on the environment. So in high income families and populations, the trait is quite heritable. A lot of the variation in IQ is down to genetics. But in lower income situations, less of the variation is due to genetics, more of it is due to variation in the environment. So, because the environment is more variable in ways that affect the manifestation of the trait.
Yeah. So I guess when I was in grad school, clinical psych and everything, the way that it was, when reading all the literature, it was, it's a broad range, right? But I'll say one thing about it. The way I was trained was 30 to 60% of intelligence is heritable, right? Like it is there, and people can argue about it, well, it's more 40%, it's more 50%, but the range that was given, maybe that's too broad, but it was about 30 to 60%. The thing with this is that reading that, I know people get really, there's so much bullshit around this that people can't have intelligent conversations about it. I would say almost delusional and undeniable because of what you just said. If all these other things about humans show variation and show genetic predispositions, why wouldn't intelligence, if we are different from other apes, not have a genetic component to it? And so the point of it would be, well, if you want to say 30, 60, 50, 40, but the fact is that there is a heritable aspect to it. Now, I think what you just said was super important, which was there is going to be variance based on the environment that people are in. So you have high income families, low income families. There is going to be kind of external forces or inputs from the environment that are going to shape and mold all of that. I think the problem that people have is, well, on both sides of this, is one is, well, if you say that there is a heritable trait, then you're saying that A, that can't change, And if you have, let's say, an IQ of 90, which is the lowest score for average, that's not going to change. That's how I am. And it's all because of genetics. And I don't think anybody, well, I guess some people are, but I think responsible people aren't saying that. They're saying there's a component and environmental factors impact. So how would you explain, again, kind of going with the same thing, using intelligence as an example, how do we understand what is contributing to us from the environment, and how can we tease that out from genetics, and or what's the interaction with those?
Okay, so so there's a few things I want to say. First of all, when we look at IQ like that, we see, X percentage is of the variance. X percentage of the variance across the population is attributable to genetic variation. Now, there's two things to say about that. One is that the rest of it doesn't have to be environmental by default, right? It's non-genetic, but a lot of that could be developmental. It could be just how your brain develops, right? So there's the inference that whatever is not genetic must be environmental is not supported. A lot of it can be inherently developmental in origin, and we don't really know for IQ how much of that to expect is, but there's certainly a lot of room for a lot of it to be developmental in origin. However, I'm not going to argue that it's not highly environmentally affected as well. In fact, I'm going to illustrate that in a sec. But before I do, just to move on from this kind of abstract discussion about heritability and twin studies and so on, we've moved way beyond that in the field, because many, many people now have found lots and lots of genetic variants that affect intelligence. And they come in those same two flavors that I was talking about earlier with respect to autism. There are some really rare mutations that cause dramatic decrements in intelligence that either manifest as frank intellectual disability that gets clinically diagnosed, or that people can carry without knowing about it, but that still cause them to have a much lower IQ than they would have earlier, or otherwise, if they didn't have that specific mutation. Okay, so there's we all carry some rare mutations. Actually, probably all of us have some decrement from what a fully wild type human would have. a fully wild type human has never existed and never will. But this sort of Platonic ideal, right? So all of us carry some rare mutations, and then all of us also carry this big background of common variants, which again, it's not that some of them are causing an increase in intelligence and some of them are causing a decrease. They're really all probably causing a decrease. And there's good evidence that they're being selected against, even the common ones. It's just that they have such a small effect that selection doesn't act on them very strongly. So what's interesting when we look at those genes is that either the common ones or the rare ones, again, are hitting neurodevelopmental genes. They're not hitting particular pathways. They're not hitting particular neurotransmitters. They're not reflecting, it could have been, say, that the metabolic rate of our neurons affected our intelligence, that some people were just running faster hardware than other people. And that's not the case. From genetically speaking, it doesn't look like it. It doesn't look like, some people have more glutamate signaling than others or anything like that. It's just really broadly and sort of irritatingly non-specific. Right? If you want to understand the biology of intelligence, what the genetics is telling us is that it's an emergent trait of the whole system. It's an emergent property of the whole system. It's kind of, I liken it to performance of a sports car, say, right? Performance is the overall way that it drives. It's not linked to any particular component. Variation in all of the components can affect performance, and importantly, how they interact and work together.
Right. How many cylinders, how much horsepower, the drive track, all those things.
So all of those things go to the performance of the car. And I think of intelligence as the performance of the brain, which is not helpful in terms of understanding the biology. But I think at some point we just have to realize there is no molecular biology to pick at there. The genetics is telling us it's just a non-specific trait. It's an index, actually. It's an indicator it's not a thing that the brain does. It's an indicator of how well the brain is put together. That's the way I think of it. And in fact, the neuroscience fits that as well, because if people have looked as hard as they can for bits of the brain that correlate with one thing or another, personality traits, but also IQ. And generally speaking, IQ correlates with global characteristics, not very specific bits of the brain. Right. It correlates with brain size. It correlates with aspects of connectivity of the whole brain that you can sort of define in network terms as efficiency of the network and so on. But it's even in neural terms, it's a non-specific kind of thing. Okay, so sorry, I just wanted to add that just so people, we could ground the discussion of the genetics of intelligence. It's not this abstract thing. There's really hard biology there. It's not very specific, but it's very clear and a strong sort of uniform, consistent message.
Yeah, and I also think that that's also the fact that should be noted is that many people say this, and this is where it gets kind of messy as well, is these are, again, when you're looking at the bell curve and you're looking at mean averages between groups of people, it's never necessarily between individuals per se. Now you can understand how individuals work, and there can be, but you always have to root individuals within context.
Okay, so two things there. One, generally speaking, you're looking at variation across a population, right? Which is your population of study. And when you work out the heritability within that population, that tells you something about that population. Right. It doesn't tell you anything about the mean, why the mean of that population is where it is, right? It only tells you what are the sources of variance in that population at the time. Right. Now, we know from generations of studies, like things like the Flynn effect, that IQ has been going up and up and up, right? In the same way that height has been going up and up and up and up, right? So people have had, again, height is a good example because it's easy to grok, I think. You may be born with a certain potential to grow to whatever height. Whether you do or not depends on how much nutrition you get especially during early years. And if you look across countries, you see a really, really strong correlation between the amount of protein that people get as children and the average height in the population. So there are environmental variables across countries that explain the differences in the mean between countries, even if within each country, within a set of environmental conditions, the trait might be quite heritable, right? So given nutrition level X, you have a whole population of people with that average nutrition level, then the variation that you'll see within that population, even though the mean is maybe higher or lower than another one, could still be quite genetic in origin. It doesn't mean that any difference between populations is genetic in origin. And that's really, really true for IQ as well. And we know that IQ has these secular trends, that it's affected by things like nutrition, maternal health care, infant health care, education, all sorts of environmental factors that have changed over time. Also the kinds of occupations that people have, the sorts of things that we do, right? As societies move from agrarian, rural societies to more urban, professional kinds of things, IQs tend to increase. And that happened in Ireland, actually, even from the 1970s. It used to be some famous psychologists like Hans Eysenck, for example. There are whole articles about how the Irish are constitutionally stupider than the English, because at the time their average IQ was lower. But actually, over 30 years or 40, 50 years, whatever it is, IQs in Ireland are just exactly the same as they are in the UK, because the population caught up in terms of urbanization and all those other trends. So it's really important to say that when we're talking about heritability and we're talking about genetic variation affecting something, what I'm talking about at least is variation between individuals within a population. I'm not talking about variation between groups that we might see, that I think is much more likely caused by social factors like the ones that I've just been discussing. So, Okay, so I realize I've taken a long time to answer the question that you started with, which was the effect of
environment.
which was the effect of the environment. Okay,
Right.
so there's been some really, really fascinating work done in the last few years by a variety of people that on using educational attainment as a phenotype. Now, you might look at educational attainment, which is basically how far you got in school, right? Did you get to the 6th grade? Did you get to the 12th grade and graduate from high school? Did you get a PhD? Whatever, you can put a number on that, right? And it is correlated with IQ. Okay, it's only partly correlated with IQ, like 0.3 or 0.4 or something like that. But it's a great proxy because it's super easy to measure in hundreds of thousands of people because you just ask them, right? How far did you get in school? You don't have to sit them down and do a 2-hour IQ test that has to be interpreted by a psychologist and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so there's a trade-off, right? It's a shitty phenotype, but you can gather it in orders of magnitude more people, and that gives massive power for genetic studies, right? Okay, so you can do the genetic studies across huge numbers of people and find that you can find common genetic variants that affect educational attainment. And it turns out that those variants also affect IQ, and they hit the same types of genes and so on. And actually, you can go further than that, because if you imagine that you discover some 1,000 genetic variants that each come in 2 varieties, one of which is associated with lower educational attainment and the opposite version with higher, right? And each of them has a tiny effect. But for any given person, you can add up how many of the ones that slightly increase educational attainment or associated with increase versus associated with a decrease, and then you can put them on a curve of your what's called a polygenic score, right? So you've used the genetics to discover a bunch of genetic variants that are associated with the trait, and then you characterize individuals relative to that bank of genetic variants and see, are they on the kind of the plus side of the curve or the minus side, and then you can compare their polygenic score. And the real benefit here is that you can take that into a new population that you didn't gather the data in, and then you can test how predictive is it. And when you do that, right, people like Robert Plomin have done this, for example, and others, you do find that there is a correlation across the levels of the polygenic score. If you could bin it into, say, 10 bins, across those 10 bins from the lowest to the highest, the average educational attainment does go up. Okay, so now there's a massive caveat to that, which is that the spread of educational attainment at each of those levels of the polygenic score is massive. So in fact, for making a prediction about an individual, it's almost useless.
Right.
But at the same time, there's a trend across the population that's visible and real. Okay, so now what's really, really interesting then is to say, okay, well, what does that polygenic score reflect? Is it just something about the person and the way their brain is put together, as I've described? Or is it something else? And the something else in this case could be something about their family environment. Because when you just take a bunch of unrelated people, unlike in twin studies, you're not controlling for the family environment.
Right.
If the family environment itself is affected by the genes that contribute to intelligence, because you share those genes with your parents and they create an environment. So someone who has a higher polygenic score themselves, their parents will necessarily have higher polygenic scores, which means they may create an environment which is itself more nurturing of the potential for a higher development of a higher educational attainment, or indeed of a higher IQ, because in fact IQ kind of maps educational attainment. So and one way to test that is to look at the polygenic scores of the parents, but only take the variants that they didn't transmit to their children. Okay, so I share 50% of my genetic variants with each of my 2 children, right? So for child A, you could look at you could take the genetic variants that I have and split them in 2. Half of them I contributed to him, half of them I didn't. The half that I didn't turns out to be predictive of his educational attainment. Not as much as the half that I did,
right?
predict or did contribute, but more than nothing, right? So what that's saying is that some of the effect that I'm finding that's captured in my own polygenic score for intelligence reflects the effect of those genes in my parents, which is mediated through the environment. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole bunch of other experiments that show adoption studies and so on, where they're tracking those sorts of things, which really show that that's the case. There's evidence beyond what I just said. So it's a kind of back to this idea we talked about before of a virtuous cycle or a vicious cycle, where you can have an environment that permits you to attain your sort of innate potential, versus one that tends to hinder your intellectual progress. So it's a kind of a manifestation of what's called the Matthew effect, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. I don't mean it in societal terms, but that's just the shorthand version of it, where if you start out good, then you get more benefit from it, and it tends to amplify things, and that amplification goes then socially over generations. So you can't, in that sense, tease apart the innate biological differences between people and the social consequences of those innate differences, which then manifest as the environment for the next generation that goes along.
You talked about because something isn't genetic, it must be environmental. It could be developmental. I guess the one question would be there is how do we sort of how do we parse that out? How do we understand or know, like, okay, look, this person grew up in a really bad neighborhood. They only had a single parent. They had a shitty school, but they could have been smart, or they could have acted upon many of their intelligence that they innately had. But because of all of these other environmental things that were contributing, they didn't eat very well. They only had one meal a day. They, got bullied at school or beat up, or there was crime or violence. There's just so many things. Sure. How do we know? Well,
I guess I mean, that's a really key question, right? And so part of the problem with saying that something could be due to developmental variation is it's stochastic, right? It's random. It's really hard to get a handle on it. As a source of variance, you can almost only infer its existence from a failure to find anything else that can explain it. Or in anatomical studies, like we do in model organisms and so on, you can literally just see it, right, in cells that a nerve cell goes this way versus that way sometimes, or the corpus callosum forms or it doesn't form sometimes. Mm-hmm. But it's an inference that can manifest as effects on psychological traits, although there's no reason to think that it wouldn't, given that other aspects of neural function manifest, or neural structure manifest in terms of psychological traits. So, but when you do, going back to, say, the twin studies, and we say, okay, well, say IQ is 50% heritable or 60% in some given population, and then you ask, well, what's the rest? So first of all, you can look at the shared family environment. Now, generally, it has a small effect on IQ. It's larger when the people are measured as children. It can be quite large when measured as children, and then it sort of tends to fade away when measured as adults. However, there's a caveat to that, in that the types of people who've been enrolled in those twin studies, it's not a full sampling of the whole population. There's a huge ascertainment bias, and you're really only sampling a narrow range of the environment. So we know, of course, that all kinds of environmental factors, like the ones you just sort of ran through there, can affect people's schooling, people's opportunities, and so on. And that, it's nonsense, I think, to try to look at those really constrained genetic studies and infer that there isn't environmental effects from them. Mm-hmm. For other kinds of things, like personality traits and stuff, people have looked for in systematic environmental factors that could affect, say, how neurotic you are, how extroverted you are, things like that. And there they really kind of come up empty.
Yeah, that's hard.
They've looked, they've looked and
so
looked,
hard.
right?
That's
they've looked
hard.
and looked, and really not found things that systematically correlate with those personality traits. Sorry, I keep bonging here. I apologize for that.
That's
But on the other hand, though, there are social factors that do correlate with things like educational attainment, obviously, but also with IQ. So for personality traits, they may be, say, 50% heritable. And then when people have looked, the shared family environment doesn't seem to have any effect on those. And then people have looked for systematic environmental factors in the real environment, and they don't find anything there either. And at some point, you just have to say, well, maybe it's just not environmental. I mean, maybe these things really are innate, more innate than the genetics itself suggests, in which case the innate predispositions would be an outcome of both the genetic, the genetics that you inherit, and how that program actually just ran in you idiosyncratically. So I think for some kind of psychological traits, the inference that developmental variation is important is probably stronger than for others. And I would say for IQ, we're probably on the weaker end of evidence for the non-genetic stuff being developmental as opposed to environmental. But it's hard to tell.
So just a few things here. Two last kind of points on this. All of this is super fun to talk about, and it's just so awesome to get at some of this stuff. I guess my last two is, these are big questions, so you can just kind of, as much as you want to share about it. But where does epigenetics fit into this conversation, and also the very popular neuroplasticity that people love to talk about? How do you factor these two things in? I know they're loaded terms, but just
Well, it's interesting because they're both terms that have, they're really similar, and sociologically speaking, in that they both have really particular scientific definitions, and they've both taken on a life of their own in the popular press and the popular imagination, in a way that I find just kind of weird for such technical terms, actually. So, but I can understand why, because both of them seem to promise the idea that you can override your genetic predispositions, or you can change the way your brain is wired that reflects aspects of your psychology in ways that you want to, right? So there's a kind of a self-help aspect to that, and in fact both of those terms have been co-opted by self-help gurus and so on. So just in like, I mean, the epigenetics stuff I've written about a lot, and there's some technical meanings to that term that get quite confused. The main idea is that epigenetics is a mechanism for regulating genes, regulating gene expression. And in molecular terms, what that means is a gene is a piece of DNA that just sits there, right? But it's a recipe for a protein. And some cells may need to make that protein, and other types of cells may not need to. So each cell turns on some genes and turns off others. And the way that they remember what the profile of genes that they should be expressing is, if they're a muscle cell versus a skin cell, is through this epigenetic mechanism where those patterns just get kind of locked in, right? So it's a mechanism of cellular memory. But I think people have taken it to mean that it's a mechanism of psychological memory, which there's no evidence for at all. That things are totally different. And also the idea of turning genes on or off sounds like I can turn my traits on or off. But that's only true if there's a sort of a one-to-one relationship between your genes and your traits. So for example, I can go out in the sunshine and get a suntan, right? That's an epigenetic effect. There's a change that's happening in my skin cells. They're upregulating the protein that makes melanin. That lasts for some period of time, weeks or so on, right? But eventually it goes away again. It's certainly not transmitted through generations, right? I can go out and get a suntan and my children are not going to be any darker skinned because of that, right? So the idea that this, that epigenetics in the brain could cause sort of, lasting rewiring of traits, psychological traits, is sort of misplaced on many levels. First, it misunderstands the relationship between genes and traits, which we spent a long time discussing earlier, how complex that is and how indirect it is. Secondly, it misunderstands the idea of the cellular memory and how long that can last. And then finally, the idea of transgenerational transmission of, things like the effects of trauma and so on through epigenetics. There's just no evidence for that. There's no mechanism for it. And there's no need for it, because actually, you can have transgenerational psychological transmission of trauma in a very real way, a sociological way. You don't need to flash it up with a sexy, sciencey sounding term to increase the truthiness of the claim that, something bad happened to a set of people and their descendants are still suffering from it. That's fine. All of that makes perfect sociological sense. You don't need the epigenetics to make it sound more truthful. And the same, is true for neuroplasticity. Yes, the brain changes. Of course it changes. That's its job, right, is to adapt to the environment, to learn. Although at some point, it sort of stops doing wholesale changes. As I said, it's got this exuberance of synapses. There's this long period when there's loads of changes happening and the young brain is very, very plastic. But then that shuts off. It doesn't just end, it actively gets shut off. And that's good, right? At some point, the thing just has to be. It has to stop becoming and just be and just work. So if you kept on having it plastic, you'd forget all the stuff that you had learned already. So there's a reason why neuroplasticity is not infinite and unlimited, because our brain has to have this balance between maintaining everything that it has learned and still allowing some change to happen. But the change is, generally at a very local level. So if we think about, how this applies to psychological traits, I guess the way I think about those things like extroversion and neuroticism and so on, is that they reflect innate sort of tuning of circuits in the brain that, like, there aren't circuits in the brain for extroversion, but there may be circuits for novelty salience or reward sensitivity, or for, with respect to neuroticism, there are circuits for risk sensitivity or threat sensitivity. And we know there are, because we can identify them in animals. We can tweak them up or down. We can tune them up or down. We can make an animal more risk averse. We can make an animal more impulsive, more confident in its decisions, more willing to wait for a delay. And so we know that those kind of circuits exist. They affect really the parameters of decision making. And so those circuits, like all the other circuits in our brain, should be expected to vary between people. And so some people, therefore, are tuned with slightly more reward sensitivity than others. So, you and I could be having the exact same sort of experience, and one of us might find it subjectively much more rewarding than the other person does. Now, over time, I think how that manifests in terms of change is that it manifests in the way that our habits emerge and the way that our character emerges and the way that we adapt to our environments. It doesn't manifest necessarily, it doesn't feed back necessarily to change the underlying trait. It's just how it's the manifestation of the trait that I think is open to change. And when people are talking about, self-help and so on, and breaking habits and things like that, yes, you can break habits, right? I mean, it's effortful. It's effortful to do that, but you can break the habits that may be a manifestation of underlying, say, neuroticism, without changing the underlying thing itself, right? Just like you can be a shy person and you can practice to be good at giving public speeches. It doesn't mean you're less shy than you were before. It just means you've adapted to that particular context. So the way that I see the neuroplasticity and the epigenetics is reaching for something that we don't need, right? We don't need to want to remodel those basic things, and it may not be possible, but it is possible to change how we adapt to the world given those biological predispositions. And to me, it makes much more sense to recognize those things in ourselves and accept them, and then think, okay, given that, how am I going to deal with this situation or that situation? That feels more scientifically realistic. But just on a personal note, that's not a scientific opinion. It feels more healthy
Yes.
to me as a way of living than constantly thinking I must change myself at some fundamental level.
Absolutely. I mean, that would make what I do every day of, I would be a fraud then if that was the case, but be like, I'm trying to change things I can't change. It's obviously we can change adaptations and behavior and, habits and, but I don't think you need to change all at the neuronal level necessarily. I don't think it's necessary. So I agree. So I'll just say this, maybe just before I let you go, it might be helpful just to, just because that was so much wonderful and rich information, just a brief 90-second summary here about what we know about genes. Things are or are not genetically determined, what we know about the environment, and what we know about variation within development. What is the kind of summary statement you can say about it all?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So, well, like I started, there is a program for making a human brain, right? Generally, we all have our own version of that, but we also have our own version of how that program is expressed. That is a unique outcome, never to be repeated. I think there's something beautiful in that. Oh, yeah. That each of us really is a precious little snowflake, entirely unique. And there's a limit, therefore, to, ideas of genetic determinism. On the one hand, that's one of the implications of that, is that we could know everything about the human genome, everything about how it affects how the brain develops, and still have only limited predictive power about how any given human genome will develop, into a person with a brain, because that inherent stochastic element is there, and it can never be predicted in principle, not just in practice. It can never be predicted in principle, which I think also has implications when we start getting into the realm of people talking about selecting embryos on polygenic scores for intelligence and stuff like that. So but I guess the main message I would have is a way of thinking about that relationship, which is fundamentally developmental and fundamentally about that ongoing trajectory of first the ongoing trajectory of the interplay of your genes and the developmental program that leads to this sort of outcome at birth, but then the ongoing interplay with your environment and the sort of feedback that you get, that as we grow and choose our experiences, craft our own environments, and as our habit and our character emerges, and really as we become who we are as adults, it's shaped by our genetics. It's shaped by the way our brains developed, but it's also shaped by our environment in a way that you can't tease out those separate components. They're fundamentally intertwined. You can do it at the population level as components of variance. It just doesn't apply in the same way to individuals.
No, that's wonderful. Yeah. Kevin, I mean, you've been super generous with your time and your energy. There's definitely many things I learned in reading the book and the conversation. It was just such a joy. Maybe sometime in the future you can come back and we can talk just strictly about neuropsychiatric and psychiatric disorders. That's kind of more along my wheelhouse as well. And so we did a little bit of it, which I was really happy we did. So I think that's really important as well. So
great. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.
Absolutely. And just real quick, tell people where they can get your book, where they can find you, all that good stuff.
Well, it's sure. Yeah, the book is available from Princeton University Press, but you can get it on Amazon or anywhere else. I'm well, you can find me often on Twitter, actually, at Wiring the Brain. I love to talk about genes, brains, minds, all that good stuff. And I have a website also called Wiring the Brain, where I write blogs that people might find useful too.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Great, my pleasure. Thanks a lot.
All right.